Hi, I'm Diane Brady, and I'm here with Jessi Hempel, who is Senior Editor-at-Large at LinkedIn, host of Hello Monday podcast, and most importantly, Jessi, the author of The Family Outing, which is a memoir about your own family coming out. I want to start with the fact of what made you decide to write about your own family, and that seems like a perilous exercise to me.
I know, Diane. I even as you say it, I'm really hopeful that everyone is talking to me at Thanksgiving time. I joke about that a little bit, but I this is new territory for me. I'm a technology and business journalist. I've spent 2 decades tracking tech companies, and if you want me to tell you anything about the balance sheet of Google, I'm very comfortable talking about it. But if you asked me to describe the emotional lives of my family members, that would probably be the last thing I wanted to write about up until the pandemic. So, I don't know what the pandemic was like for you, but for me, it was this moment of reconsideration. Everything that I thought I understood about myself was suddenly up for review.
Mm-hmm.
I had been a city person, but suddenly I was living very much in the country. I had been a person who went to an office every day, but suddenly I was at home. I had been a huge extrovert, but suddenly I didn't want to talk to anyone. Well, almost anyone, Diane, but the thing that I found really interesting was that during that period of time, I did end up speaking to my mother and my father and my sister and my brother nearly every day. And I began to think about how unusual this was, that I was so close with these people, my family members. And maybe for a lot of families that's not unusual, but in my family it was unusual because we had had a very, very hard time when we were young, a hard time with each other and a hard time individually. We had probably been that family you would think would never end up very close when we were older.
Let's tell people a bit about what this story is about. I know that the top line, people talk about embracing queer identity. There's a certain, interest in the fact that so many members of your family did, in terms of sexual identity. You came out as gay, I believe, in 94. Your father.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about you were the first person in your family to come out, and just the sort of domino effect that had, because I found that fascinating.
Well, so as I said, we had a really hard time when we were kids. Our family felt like it looked great on the outside, but on the inside, it didn't feel great for anyone. And for me, I always knew I was the oldest of 3 children. I knew from a very young age that I was gay, except that I didn't have a word for what I was. And I didn't have any images around me for what I was. I lived in Massachusetts, a suburb of Massachusetts, fairly progressive place, but just nobody was talking about that in the 1980s and early 90s when I was a child. Now, as soon as I got to Brown University and I began to see role models around me of people who had come out of the closet, I had a name and a framework for an identity for this thing that I felt that I was, and I glommed onto it. I grabbed it. I remember I came out to my parents. I came out to my parents in a car, which it turns out is actually a fairly normal place for people to come out to their
Everyone's
parents.
staring at the road, not each other. It's, neutral territory.
Very safe that way, right? I bet you if you're watching and you've come out of the closet, there's a 50% chance you did it in a car. But, so I come out to my parents. My mom says, the right thing. She tells me she loves me. She cries. My dad says nothing. Next morning, my dad walks into the kitchen. He's eating some cereal and he says to me, I thought I was gay once too. I was like, what are you talking about, Dad? And he said, well, I did, but you make choices in your life and I chose to marry your mom. And he walked out of the house and he went off to work. And that for me, Diane, was this really pivotal moment in my family because I realized, oh gosh, I think Dad might be gay. But it took my dad another 3 years to realize that not only was he gay, but he was going to have to act on that. He was going to have to find a way to express that in his identity.
Well, he didn't choose to come out so much as he was outed by your sister, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. My sister, who was then in college, middle child in our family, she was on an early chat application, an application called ICQ. She was chatting with her boyfriend from college, and up popped an unfamiliar name And my sister realized that my father had been engaged in relationships other than the one to my mother with guys. And so she kind of uncloaked my father, as it were. And at first, my father tried to stuff the genie of his identity back into the bottle and just like keep everything the same. But of course, nothing could stay the same. And as a result, he came out of the closet. He and my mother started a very long process of reestablishing their relationship, otherwise known as divorcing. Mm-hmm. And in the midst of that, my sister comes out as bisexual. My brother comes out as transgender. And my mom, through all of this, she finds the courage to call herself a survivor of a series of crimes that were so heinous that I actually had to go very slow in even learning about them. And at first, and certainly when it was happening, Diane, I thought that these were totally different experiences for everybody. But with the long sweep of history and with the ability to look back 20 years into the past, as I started writing this memoir in 2020, I realized that actually this process of coming out, though it had a different expression for each of us, was actually a fairly similar process, if that makes sense.
Well, it's become so politicized, sexual identity, especially I think about your brother and transgender rights and such. And let me start with the fact, do you equate, your mother's experience as a PTSD experience? Would you put the experience of you and your other family members in the same bucket looking back, or is it very different?
I mean, each of us had a very different experience, but I think that there is something very common to the experience of coming out. And I think that we all have to come out about all kinds of things in our lives. The LGBTQI community has adopted that term to describe the process of reckoning with one's sexual identity, but it doesn't belong to us alone. I tend to think, Diane, that we're all born into a set of expectations that aren't in alignment with who we are. Usually I think this happens out of love for the most part, right? Like, your baby arrives and your parents look at the baby and they start to dream of who the baby gets to be. And our communities have ideas about who will be, and our religious communities, our geographic communities. And then inevitably we grow in the world and we're not that person. And I think of any time that we can speak our truth, especially when it is in misalignment with the truths of our communities, that is the process of coming out. So for my mom, in one way, coming out was coming out as a survivor. For me, one of the many things I've come out as is a lesbian woman, but it's just one of the ways that I've come out.
When you think about, we talk about bringing our whole selves to work, but yet people feel very threatened still by certain elements, of sexual identity. What do you see? You're on the front lines in your job, obviously, in terms of reaction to this book. It feels like a new era to some extent, but do you still find that this is a place where a lot of people are still hiding their true selves, or that this backlash that we're seeing is going to have an impact on transgender, especially youths?
Well, there's such a mismatch in the moment that we are in between what is actually happening on the ground between individual people and our political landscape. And the thing that makes me most excited is what I see every day in relationships between people, which is a greater ability for each of us to more authentically express who we are and to be accepting of it. And I think that runs in contradiction to what we're seeing in the political landscape, which is this huge backlash. And we're seeing safeties that I took for granted restricted. My brother, who is a transgender man, has a very different experience of his reality in 2022 than he did even in 2016 when his first child was born. Just this morning, I spoke to a lawyer on the phone to get second parent adoption set up for my children.
Congratulations.
I know, but you know what? I shouldn't have to do this, Diane, because federal marriage is legal for me. And I am on the birth certificate for both of my children in the state of New York. But that birth certificate is a state document. And should federal marriage fall, and it's looking more and more likely that there's a real possibility that it will, suddenly when I leave the state of New York, I'm not legally considered the parent of my children. Like, that's going backwards, right? And so it is befuddling to me that that can happen, that political backlash can happen at the same time as our media role models are expanding. The internet is affording us the opportunity to connect to more and more people who share our experiences, even when geography doesn't. Now, I am an optimist at heart. I believe that what humanity is going through right now is a revolution of sorts, and that ultimately authenticity will win. But right now, in this moment, things feel dark.
One other question. You have a very public life, Jessi. Your family does not, but now you have put them into the public sphere. What has been their reaction or the reaction of the people around them?
Yes, I have to say, I am used to talking and writing about my life. I've spent many years doing it. That is not the same for the other four main characters of this book. And they have just gone through a process willingly and with great generosity in which they allowed me to tell these stories. And they shared these stories with me and then allowed me to share them with a broader audience. And it's uncomfortable, right? And we're still pretty close to the launch. And so I think that there's a lot of just sort of trepidation as we wait to see how the stories are being received. And at the same time, they're being received so well, and people are celebrating my family for the choices that they have made. And I think that has been really reassuring.
Yeah, well, it is a very human story. I read it, I loved it. Congratulations, and I hope other people get the chance to read it too. So thanks for joining us, Jessi.
Thank you, Diane.